It was the kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time, forgotten by the living and claimed by the dead. The town was a whisper among locals, spoken of in hushed tones and with nervous glances toward the forest. Nobody dared to go near it, except for Ethan Caldwell, a journalist obsessed with uncovering the truth behind its haunting legends. Armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and an old leather-bound map he had purchased from a strange man at a roadside diner, Ethan ventured into the unknown, determined to unravel the mystery of Ashbourne. The journey began innocently enough. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, and the fading sunlight painted the world in hues of orange and gold. But as he crossed the threshold marked by a crooked sign that read Ashbourne, founded 1852, the air grew heavy. The colors drained from the world, and an unnatural silence fell over the forest. No bird sang, no insects chirped. The only sound was the crunch of his boots on the gravel path. The town loomed ahead, its crumbling buildings cloaked in shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. Every window was a black void, and every door hung ajar like a gaping maw. Despite the suffocating unease that coiled in his gut, Ethan pressed on, his curiosity outweighing his fear. The first house he entered smelled of mildew and decay, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper that revealed cryptic symbols etched into the wood beneath. A faded photograph lay on a table, showing a family of four with faces too blurry to distinguish. Ethan reached out to pick it up, but the moment his fingers brushed the brittle paper, a faint, childlike giggle echoed through the room. He spun around, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was no one there. "Just the wind," he muttered, though the air in the room felt utterly still. As he backed out of the house, his flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he thought he saw a figure standing in the doorway of the house across the street, tall and shadowy, with glowing eyes that pierced the gloom. But when he blinked, it was gone. Ethan's heart raced as he made his way to the town square, where a rusted fountain stood dry and cracked, its centerpiece a statue of a hooded figure holding an open book. The inscription at its base was barely legible, but as he squinted to make out the words, he felt a hand brush against his shoulder. He spun around, only to find the square empty. "Hello," he called, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. He turned, and there, at the edge of the square, stood a woman in a tattered dress. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her eyes, black as the void, seemed to bore into his soul. Before he could react, she dissolved into the mist, leaving behind a faint whisper, "Leave before it's too late." Ignoring the warning, Ethan ventured into the town's church, its spire leaning precariously as if bowing to an unseen force. Inside, rows of pews were overturned, and the altar was scorched black. Strange markings covered the walls, and the air smelled of sulfur. At the center of the room lay a book, its cover made of weathered leather, and its pages filled with writing that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. Unable to resist, Ethan opened it, and the moment he did, the candles lining the walls burst into flame, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the room. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and indecipherable, like 100 voices speaking at once. Ethan's vision blurred, and he felt an overwhelming pressure in his chest, as if unseen hands were squeezing the life out of him. Staggering out of the church, he gasped for air and realized the mist had thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Panic set in as he realized the path he had taken into town was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of twisting streets that seemed to shift and change with every step. The shadows grew darker, more solid, and he could feel them closing in, one by one. The buildings seemed to come alive, their windows glowing with an eerie light, and from within he could hear the faint sound of chanting. He stumbled into what appeared to be a library, its shelves lined with books that oozed a black, tar-like substance. At the center of the room stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its face obscure but its presence radiating pure malice. The figure spoke without moving its lips, its voice echoing in Ethan's mind. "You should not have come here." Ethan tried to run, but his legs refused to move. The shadows closed in, their cold tendrils wrapping around him and pulling him to the ground. As his vision dimmed, he realized the truth. Ashbourne was not abandoned. It was alive, a sentient entity that fed on the souls of those foolish enough to enter. The last thing he heard was the sound of his own name being whispered over and over, growing louder until it was all-consuming. And then there was nothing but darkness. Years later, hikers would claim to hear faint cries for help emanating from the ruins of Ashbourne. Some even claimed to see a figure with a flashlight wandering the streets, forever searching for a way out. But no one dared to enter, for they knew that once Ashbourne claimed you, it never let go. The Blackridge Asylum had stood for over a century on the edge of a lonely, wind-swept hill, its iron gates rusted and its sprawling stone walls wrapped in vines. The townsfolk whispered of horrors that had taken place within, of experiments too unspeakable to be documented, and of patients who vanished as if swallowed by the building itself. It had been abandoned for decades, a monument to human cruelty and madness, but that didn't stop urban explorers and thrill-seekers from venturing inside. Most came back shaken, swearing never to return. A few never came back at all. Alex Nolan was not like the others. A seasoned paranormal investigator with an insatiable curiosity, Alex believed the stories were nothing more than exaggerated tales designed to scare away trespassers. With his camera, recording equipment, and a flashlight that cut through the thickest darkness, he set out to explore the asylum alone, determined to uncover the truth. The night was unusually cold, and the wind howled like a chorus of the damned as Alex approached the gates. Pushing them open, he was met with a groaning creak that echoed into the abyss. Beyond the gates, the asylum loomed like a sleeping giant, its broken windows resembling hollow eyes. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The lobby stretched out before him, its tile floor cracked and its walls scrawled with graffiti that mingled with faded messages left by the asylum's former residents. Words like "help me" and "it watches" sent a shiver down Alex's spine, though he dismissed them as the work of vandals. He turned on his camera, the red recording light a small comfort in the oppressive darkness, and began to narrate. "The Blackridge Asylum," he said, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. Abandoned in 1957, shrouded in mystery and said to be one of the most haunted places in the country. Tonight, we'll see if the legends hold any truth. As Alex ventured deeper, the silence became suffocating. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the building itself was amplifying the sound to remind him of his solitude. In the hallway leading to the patient quarters, he noticed strange details. Doors that appeared to have been clawed from the inside, metal restraints still bolted to the walls, and a faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to follow him. He paused to listen, but the whispering stopped. Shaking off the feeling, he entered one of the rooms. The bed frame was rusted. The mattress rotted away. But on the wall above the bed, someone had etched a chilling phrase. "The doctor is still here." The words lingered in Alex's mind as he moved to the next room, and then the next, each one more unsettling than the last. In one, he found a doll sitting upright in a chair, its porcelain face cracked, its black eyes staring at him as if alive. In another, a journal lay open on the floor, its pages covered in frantic, illegible scribbles except for one coherent line. "Do not look at the mirrors." Alex's flashlight flickered, and he tapped it impatiently, muttering under his breath. When it steadied, he froze. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement in the reflection of a shattered mirror hanging on the wall. Turning quickly, he found nothing there, but the mirror showed something. A shadow, impossibly tall, standing just behind him. Heart pounding, Alex spun again, this time catching the faintest glimpse of a figure disappearing into the darkness at the end of the hallway. Against his better judgment, he gave chase, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. The corridor twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. leading him to a door that hadn't been on the map he'd studied. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it, a staircase spiraled downward into the earth. Alex hesitated, but his curiosity won out. Descending the stairs, he entered a basement that was far too large to fit beneath the asylum. The walls were damp and pulsated as though alive, and the air was filled with a low hum that vibrated in his bones. In the center of the room stood an operating table, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. Surrounding it were tools of torment, scalpels, bone saws, and devices Alex couldn't even begin to name. But it was the figure hunched over the table that stopped him cold. A man in a tattered white coat, his back to Alex, was muttering to himself in a guttural, inhuman voice. The man turned suddenly, revealing a face that was grotesquely stretched, as though skin and muscle had been pulled far beyond their natural limits. His eyes were hollow pits, and his smile was impossibly wide, filled with teeth that seemed to go on forever. "Welcome, patient," the figure said, his voice a cacophony of different tones. Before Alex could react, the room shifted violently, the walls closing in and the shadows coming alive. He ran, his camera bouncing against his chest, capturing fleeting images of hands reaching out from the darkness and faces appearing in the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. No matter how far or fast he ran, the hallway stretched endlessly before him, the door at the end always just out of reach. Eventually, exhausted and gasping for air, Alex stumbled into a room that was not on any blueprint he had studied. The walls were covered in mirrors, each reflecting not his own image, but twisted versions of himself, some bloodied, some skeletal, some wearing that same grotesque smile as the doctor. In the center of the room was a chair, and before he could stop himself, Alex felt an unseen force pushing him into it. Restraint snaked out from the chair's arms and legs, binding him in place. The mirrors began to ripple, and one by one, the versions of himself stepped out, circling him like predators. The last thing the camera recorded was Alex's terrified scream, abruptly cut off as the lens was splattered with blood. The camera was found years later, lying in the lobby of the asylum, its battery dead and its memory card corrupted. No one knows what truly happened to Alex Nolan, but some say his voice can still be heard echoing through the halls, begging for help. And on nights when the moon is full, some have claimed to see a figure wandering the asylum grounds, clutching a camera and muttering about mirrors. But those who see him rarely live to tell the tale, for Blackridge Asylum does not forgive those who disturb its restless dead. No one in the small, rural town of Wayhaven dared to speak of the house on Hollow Road, not since the disappearance of the Myers family 50 years ago. The house, with its crooked chimneys and sagging roof, seemed to breathe its own sinister life, its boarded windows watching the world like the blind eyes of some malevolent creature. Local lore said the house wasn't built, but rather grew out of the cursed earth it stood on, feeding on the misfortune of those foolish enough to cross its threshold. Many claimed to hear screams carried on the wind near its dilapidated porch, while others swore to have seen faint candlelight flickering in its upper windows despite its abandonment. But to 25-year-old skeptic and urban explorer Claire Bennett, these were nothing more than quaint ghost stories, exaggerated by bored townsfolk with too much imagination. When Claire arrived in Wayhaven, she was greeted with suspicious glances and warnings thinly veiled as polite advice. "Don't go near that house, miss," an elderly shopkeeper told her as she stocked up on supplies. "It doesn't like visitors." Claire had laughed it off, attributing the man's words to harmless superstition, and set off on foot toward Hollow Road that same afternoon. As she walked the overgrown path toward the house, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the surrounding woods into an eerie half-light. The air felt heavier the closer she got, and an unnatural quiet settled over the landscape. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area, their usual songs replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of unseen things in the bushes. When the house came into view, it was even more unsettling than Claire had imagined. The structure leaned awkwardly, as though exhausted by its own existence, and the wood of its exterior was blackened with age, giving it the appearance of a rotting carcass. Despite her initial confidence, Claire hesitated at the threshold, staring at the door that hung slightly ajar. It beckoned her like the open mouth of a predator waiting to snap shut. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the sagging porch, the boards creaking under her weight, and stepped inside. The air within was cold, far colder than it should have been, and carried a damp, metallic scent that made her stomach churn. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed by her intrusion, and the floor was littered with fragments of broken furniture and strange symbols carved into the wood. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper and crooked picture frames whose images had faded into obscurity. The house seemed to sigh around her, the walls groaning as though they resented her presence. As she moved deeper into the house, Claire began to feel an odd sensation, a prickling at the back of her neck as though she were being watched. She turned quickly, her flashlight sweeping the shadows, but nothing was there, just the empty, yawning hallways and the faint creak of wood settling. She dismissed the feeling as nerves and pressed on, determined to prove the legends wrong. In the kitchen, she found a table set for a meal that had never been eaten. Plates and silverware sat undisturbed, covered in decades of dust. Yet the chairs were oddly askew, as though the diners had left in haste. On the far wall, a large black stain spread like a grotesque spiderweb, and in the center of it, she could make out what appeared to be the imprint of a hand, burned into the wood. The further she ventured, the more unsettling the house became. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, she found a child's doll sitting upright on a decaying bed. Its porcelain face was cracked, and its glass eyes seemed to follow her as she moved. Next to it lay a journal, its cover stained and brittle. She opened it carefully, flipping through pages filled with frantic scrawls. "It comes at night. It watches us from the walls. We can't leave." The final entry was smeared with something dark and read simply, "Don't answer the knocking." Just as she finished reading, a sharp sound echoed through the house. A knock, deliberate and rhythmic, coming from the far end of the hallway. Claire froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The knocking came again, louder this time, and accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. She swung her flashlight toward the noise, but the beam only illuminated an empty corridor. Gathering her courage, she called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Her voice sounded small and fragile, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. The knocking ceased, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around her. "Get out," it said, the words stretching and twisting unnaturally. Claire stumbled backward, her mind racing as the temperature in the house plummeted further. The shadows along the walls began to shift, elongating and writhing like living things. Suddenly, one of them broke free, a humanoid figure composed entirely of darkness that surged toward her with an inhuman screech. Claire bolted down the stairs, her flashlight flickering wildly as she tripped and stumbled through the house. The walls seemed to close in on her, the narrow hallways twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Doors she had left open slammed shut, and others appeared where they hadn't been before, leading her deeper into the labyrinth of the house. She could hear the whispers growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of incomprehensible voices, each one filled with malice. Finally, she burst into the living room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The front door was gone, replaced by a blank wall covered in the same cryptic symbols she had seen outside. The shadows gathered in the corners, coalescing into grotesque shapes with glowing red eyes and twisted smiles. They surrounded her, blocking every possible escape. As the darkness closed in, Claire's flashlight died, plunging her into total blackness. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and she felt cold, claw-like hands gripping her arms, pulling her downward. The last thing she saw before she was swallowed by the void was a pair of glowing eyes staring at her from the far end of the room, and the last thing she heard was a low, mocking laugh. Weeks later, Hikers in the area reported hearing faint screams coming from the direction of Hollow Road, though none dared to investigate. The house remains there to this day, its presence a stain on the land, waiting patiently for its next visitor. Those brave or foolish enough to approach it claim to see a woman's silhouette standing at the window, staring out with hollow eyes. And when the wind blows just right, they say you can hear her whisper, "Don't answer the knocking. Remember, the darkness always holds a story." Until the next terrifying tale, stay tuned with Campfire Horror Story.